At the start of February 1942, Japanese troops under General Tomoyuki Yamashita arrived on the southern shores of Malaya. They had rampaged south for the last 50 days and could now set their sights on the last Allied toehold on the peninsula. The jewel in Britain's crown of Far East possessions, Singapore. Singapore was an island. In the mind of Winston Churchill, this made it ideal to function as a fortress, to hold out against Japanese attack until help could arrive. He described the water surrounding it as a splendid moat. But to Churchill's consternation, he was informed on January 19, 1942, that very little defensive work had been done to fortify the northern shore of the island against attack from the mainland, either before the war or during it. Churchill was furious at this, fuming to the chiefs of staff that the fortress of Singapore was not entirely fortified against an attack from the northward. What is the use of having an island for a fortress if it is not to be made into a citadel? Churchill, though, should perhaps have known that Singapore was never intended to be a citadel or any other kind of fortress for that matter. The defences of the naval base were set up to defeat attacks from the sea, with defence on the landward side to be provided by troops fighting in Malaya, keeping enemy troops well to the north and out of artillery range of the naval base. Therefore, no land defences had ever been constructed on Singapore Island, but this did not stop Churchill from getting it into his head that Singapore was a fortress that could hold out against the odds. Precisely how he expected the naval base, which if we remember was the main reason for holding Singapore in the first place, to continue functioning while under artillery fire in the front line, was a mystery. Many of the commanders on the ground in Singapore thought there was little chance of holding the island for very long for this reason. Orders were orders though. Churchill was very clear that he wanted no thought of surrender until protracted fighting among the ruins of Singapore City. So it fell to Arthur Percival, General Officer commanding in Malaya, to organise the defence. Percival had an impressive sounding 85,000 Allied troops on the island, but around 15,000 of these were non-combat personnel. This left a multinational force of around 70,000 troops. There were 13 British battalions, mostly part of the newly arrived 18th Division, which was at full strength. 6 Australian battalions in the 8th Australian Infantry Division, which had been restored to full strength with the addition of 1,900 untrained replacements. 17 Indian battalions, which were the battered remainder of the Indian Third Corps. 13 of these were the product of merging battered units together earlier in the campaign, and only 1 was at full strength. There were also 2 regular Malay battalions and 3 battalions from the Straits Settlements Volunteer Force. It was a large but flawed force, with low morale from the weeks of retreat they had just been through. The Allies did have some things going for them though. For example, there was a large amount of artillery on the island, 9 artillery regiments as well as a variety of naval guns which, despite what you might have heard, were able to fire at targets on land. They were just stocked with armour-piercing rounds for anti-ship fire, not the high explosive rounds that would be good for artillery fire. The key decision for General Percival in early February was where to position his forces. In his opinion, the most likely area for Japanese landings was in the northeast, in the vicinity of the naval base. Both General Wavell, the Allied commander for Southeast Asia, and General Gordon Bennett, in command of the Australian troops, thought it more likely that the Japanese would cross in the northwest, where the strait was narrower. But Percival was adamant. The strongest Allied force, the fresh British 18th Division, would be positioned in the northeast, along with the remainder of the Indian 11th Division. The Australian 8th Division would take the western sector, along with the 44th and 15th Indian Brigades, leaving the 2 Malayan brigades and volunteer forces to secure the southern coast. The 12th Indian Brigade would be maintained as the only real reserve formation. Across the water, General Tomoyuki Yamashita was also weighing up his options. He correctly assessed that the British defences were stronger around the northeastern side of the island, so decided to land his forces on the western side. This was helped by the fact that 2 of his 3 divisions were already on the western side, since that was where they had advanced from, so organising the landings would be an easier logistical task. Yamashita planned for the first wave to attack the positions of the Australian 22nd Infantry Brigade. He would deploy the full force of the 18th and 5th Divisions, with 16 battalions hitting the beaches to overwhelm the 3 Australian battalions that would oppose them. Heavy reinforcement was then planned. The 1st Tank Regiment would land on the established beachhead, while the Imperial Guards Division would make a second landing on the northern shore of the island, supported by the 14th Tank Regiment. At just after 8:30 PM on February 8th, Australian sentries spotted landing craft emerging out of the dark. They opened fire, with Vickers machine guns and short-range mortar fire sinking and damaging a number of invasion barges before they could make the shoreline. Pre-arranged light signals for artillery support were fired into the air, but there were so many Japanese troops landing that the batteries struggled to keep up with demand. Invading troops arrived on the beach in force from 8:45, and the battle quickly became chaotic. The terrain on the coast here was a mix of beaches, tidal swamps and small streams, difficult to attack and even worse to defend, since permanent positions could not be maintained in areas that were underwater for half of each day. The Australian troops were very thinly spread, to the point that virtually no units could see any other friendly groups. This, combined with the destruction of Allied phone lines by Japanese artillery barrages, made a coordinated response close to impossible, despite the fierce resistance being put up by individual units. By midnight, despite a furious battle, the large numerical superiority of the Japanese had told, and they had pushed off the coast, getting themselves the foothold on Singapore they were after. Thousands of Japanese troops came ashore overnight, and the bulk of the 5th and 18th Divisions were ashore by the end of the next day. As a result, Percival was immediately forced to commit his only real reserve, the 12th Indian Brigade, to shore up the Australian positions. Despite the size of the Japanese force that had landed though, Percival did not move any units from the eastern side of the island, and the reinforcements he had moved west constituted only about 1,000 men. On February 9th, the Japanese pushed forwards in the northwest, capturing Tenga airfield and driving the Allied forces back to the Jurong line. This defensive perimeter had been hastily surveyed in late January and was the main planned defensive barrier on the western side of the island. If it held, then Percival would still have a viable front line to work with, albeit having lost part of the island. It may not come as a surprise to you that it not only didn't hold, but fell apart with remarkable speed. In the early hours of December 10th, the Imperial Guards Division under General Nishimura forced its way ashore, driving a wedge between the 27th Australian Brigade and its beleaguered western neighbours. The northern edge of the Jurong line was now outflanked, and without waiting for orders, the 12th Brigade moved back eastwards to prevent the Guards from smashing into their rear. At the same time, General Percival was circulating plans for a final fallback line around Singapore City itself, if such a retreat became necessary. But in a microcosm of Britain's struggles with communications throughout the Malayan campaign, when the 15th and 44th Brigade commanders got a hold of this plan, they assumed the orders were to go into action immediately. Unable to confirm over the telephone as all the lines were shot, the 2 brigades fell back off the Jurong line way too early, fatally compromising it. By the end of December 10th, the line was lost, and there was no let-up from Yamashita. Both the 5th and 18th Divisions surged forwards, while the Guards continued to land troops in the north. General Percival now desperately tried to regain some measure of control. He took a battalion from each brigade of the 18th Division and created an ad hoc group known as Tom Force to plug the gaps emerging in the north. He also planned a counterattack to retake the Jurong line, but the preparations for it were quickly overtaken by Japanese advances. Overnight on February 11th, Yamashita's 5th Division pushed from Tenga airfield, scything through 12th Indian Brigade and an Australian battalion to take the key road junction at Bukit Timah, complete with its important supply depots. By 7:30, the Japanese 18th Division had cut straight through the Indian 15th Brigade, as the Allied line threatened to collapse. The Allied troops were now in disarray, but ammunition shortages on the Japanese side were beginning to make themselves felt. With no rail connections to the mainland, resupplying the attacking force was not easy. As a result, the pace of the attacks slowed, allowing Percival to concentrate a counterattack finally. 3 battalions were ordered to retake Bukit Timah, but this failed amid heavy defensive fire in the afternoon of February 11th. There was more bad news on the east of the island, as the growing strength of the Imperial Guards Division made itself felt, and Allied communications fell apart once again. Under pressure, the 27th Australian Brigade fell back unannounced, leaving the left flank of what was left of the Indian 11th Division horribly exposed. The 11th Division was forced to move south, meaning the naval base would now have to be abandoned. General Percival was forced to again dispatch another brigade-sized force from 18th Division to fill gaps between his other units, weakening his best formation once again. In the west of the fast-shrinking Allied perimeter, there was better news as the 22nd Brigade held out throughout the day against 2 Japanese regiments. The good news was fleeting though, as on February 12th the Japanese bounded forward to occupy the 3 reservoirs in the centre of Singapore Island. This was a significant moment as it cut off the water supply to Singapore City, putting a ticking clock on Allied resistance. At noon on February 12th, General Percival ordered the retreat back to the final perimeter around Singapore. His troops were battered. 22nd Australian Brigade was down to just 800 men, and morale was collapsing. The Japanese 18th Division ground forward in the southwest along the Holland Road and engaged the 1st Malayan Brigade. It was slow but steady progress until they reached the area of Pasir Panjang, where the Malayan 1st Battalion was dug in on an area of high ground known as Opium Hill. There, over the next 2 days, the Japanese tried repeatedly to take the hill, but were repulsed each time by a fearsome Malayan defence led in the front line by 2nd Lieutenant Adnan bin Saidi. When ammunition ran out, the defence carried on, with bayonets and eventually with bare hands. Lieutenant Adnan was wounded, but he remained alongside his men, resisting to the very end. After finally taking the hill, after 2 days and heavy casualties, the Japanese troops found Lieutenant Adnan badly wounded. Perhaps in some kind of retribution for the losses his leadership had cost them, the story goes that Adnan was strung up by his feet from a tree and bayoneted to death by the Japanese. Shortly after 1 PM on February 14th, the same detachments of troops arrived at Alexandra Hospital and set about committing an even greater atrocity. The hospital by this time was crammed with 900 wounded soldiers and had no defences. When a British lieutenant rushed outside to wave a white flag, he was bayoneted to death on the spot by the Japanese troops, 100 of which then rushed inside the hospital and rampaged throughout it. Dozens of patients and doctors were murdered, including 2 that were under anaesthetic on the operating table. The soldiers paused only to loot the corpses before marching the survivors out of the hospital and forcing them into a building a quarter of a mile away, where the doors and windows were nailed shut and they were left overnight without any water or ventilation. The following day, Japanese soldiers came back and murdered a further 100 of the remaining prisoners. These atrocities were carried out probably on the orders of Colonel Masanobu Tsuji. The historian Peter Thompson records, "The motive was to show Percival that an utterly mindless and totally ruthless force would be unleashed upon the citizens of Singapore if he persisted in ignoring Yamashita's demand to surrender." For Singapore, it was a precursor of atrocities to come in the weeks and months ahead. By this time, in the parts of the city still under British control, the atmosphere was starting to take on a distinctly last days of Rome feel, with looting and desertion becoming more commonplace, along with the systematic destruction in the city of anything the Japanese could find useful. Overnight on February 14th, all ships remaining in the harbour left for Java and Sumatra, carrying 3,000 refugees with them. Among the Allied generals, surrender was now very much on the table. By the end of February 14th, both the 5th and 18th Japanese divisions had reached the outskirts of Singapore and the water situation was becoming critical. On the morning of February 15th, Percival was informed the city had maybe 24 hours before the water system totally failed. He and all his commanders agreed that since there was no realistic prospect of recapturing the reservoirs to regain the water, there was now no alternative but to surrender. At 4:15 that day, Percival and his chief of staff travelled to meet with General Yamashita at Bukit Timah to agree to the Japanese demands for unconditional surrender. At 8:30 p.m, the Allied troops laid down their arms. Singapore had fallen. Singapore was Britain's worst defeat during the Second World War. In barely 2 months, the whole of Malaya and Singapore had been lost, 80,000 troops had surrendered, and Britain's entire strategy to contain the Empire of Japan had gone directly in the bin. It had been 2 months of successive bad decisions by British and Allied leaders. From Admiral Tom Phillips underestimating the power of aircraft and getting Repulse and Prince of Wales sunk, to the generals Wavell, Percival, Heath, Bennett and others, and their persistent underestimation of their opponents. The leadership right from the top was hesitant, indecisive and incapable. The story of the Allied defence of Malaya and Singapore is of an understrength, under-equipped and badly led force that was outmanoeuvred and outthought at every stage by an enemy they never took seriously enough. The numerous occasions of individual bravery by units and troops across Malaya was not enough to outweigh that. And of course we can't forget Churchill, whose insistence that Singapore could be held as a fortress had led to reinforcements being poured into a city arriving virtually only in time to surrender. He wrote simply after the war, "I ought to have known." Thank you for watching this series on the invasion and occupation of Malaya in 1941. If you want to learn more about it, including some battles I didn't include in the main video series, then please do check out this infographic poster I've created. It's got a whole bunch of information about the battles and the two sides involved, and can be a permanent resource right there on your wall with anything you'd want to know about the Malayan campaign. You can pick it up over on Teespring, and it would be great if you did, because every single poster sale or Patreon pledge really helps to continue making these videos on a permanent basis. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.